Michael Smith, an experienced 35-year-old lawyer with a stellar reputation and an unwavering pursuit of justice, arrived at a small town where time seemed frozen, like an insect in amber. His worn Volkswagen, a faithful companion of many professional journeys, slowly rolled along narrow, winding streets. On both sides stood ancient houses with gloomy facades adorned with elegant moldings and darkened shutters, evoking an inexplicable anxiety and a sense of inevitability. His main task was to analyze and organize a large archive of documents accumulated in the house over decades. The recent heir to the property needed a legal assessment of all papers before any operations with the estate. In Michael's briefcase lay an official letter from the firm's management with clearly outlined authorities and tasks for the coming days, along with a bundle of keys to all corners of the house. In front of the small but cozy Victorian house, Michael felt a cold shiver run down his spine. An elusive veil of past epochs hung in the air. The house, with its darkened windows, like the blind eyes of an old sage, and peeling paint revealing layers of decades, seemed like a silent witness to ancient secrets waiting to be uncovered. Stepping over the massive wooden threshold, worn by thousands of footsteps, he immediately felt the thick and heavy air, saturated with the smell of old wood, dust, and forgotten memories. Michael slowly moved through the cold, empty rooms, filled with the mysterious charm of ancient buildings. Massive mahogany furniture with intricate carvings, huge Venetian mirrors under a gray veil of dust, and faded paintings on the walls preserved the images of long-dead residents. On the massive oak table, covered with a fine web of scratches, lay piles of yellowed documents and letters. He arranged the stacks of papers into several piles, trying to organize them by dates and types of documents. His experienced eye quickly identified important details: dates, signatures, official seals. Among the papers were old bills, letters, notarial acts, and even several yellowed photographs showing people in early 20th century clothing. Some pages, filled with elegant handwriting, told the story of the house and its former inhabitants. Suddenly, the silence was broken by a strange sound, a light rustle behind the wall, as if someone was carefully running their hand along the wallpaper. Michael raised his head, listening intently. A moment later, footsteps echoed from deep within the house, even though he knew for certain he was alone there. Trying to maintain professional composure, he attempted to rationalize these sounds. An old building, natural settling of structures, perhaps mold in the walls or creaking wooden beams. But when a muffled woman's voice, quietly singing something, came from the adjacent room, Michael felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He slowly turned and peered into the dimly lit corridor, searching for a logical explanation for what he heard, but saw only dust particles dancing in a beam of light filtering through the dirty window. He blamed it all on fatigue and returned to work. After all, it had been a long and exhausting day, and old houses often have their own acoustics that can play strange tricks on the human mind. Michael focused on the documents before him, trying to ignore the unsettling thoughts swirling in his head. As the sun began to set, Michael decided to take a walk around the town to clear his head and think about everything he had seen. Narrow streets lined with old chestnut trees led him further from the center until he found himself near a small, cozy square. There he met an elderly woman who was pruning roses in her front garden. Upon seeing the stranger, she immediately perked up and began speaking to him without waiting for an invitation. "Ah, so you're the new resident of the old Sanders house?" she asked, squinting her eyes. "I saw you this morning when you arrived. You know, that house has quite a history. And not always a pleasant one," she added with a slight smile, though a shadow of concern flickered in her eyes. Michael approached with interest and explained that he was actually a lawyer hired by the owner. The woman introduced herself as Mary and began telling him about strange events in the house over the past decades. Unexplained night sounds, lights in the windows of the empty house, shadows that neighbors had seen. The last people who lived there didn't even last a month, she said, shaking her head. They said they heard a girl crying, saw some figures in the upper floor windows. Although, she shrugged, maybe these are just old tales. You know how it is in small towns. People love making up stories. But something in her voice suggested to Michael that there was a grain of truth in these stories. He thanked the woman for the conversation and slowly walked back to the house, pondering what he had heard. On his way to the house, he stopped at a local cafe where he ordered a large coffee and a sandwich. While waiting for his order, Michael took out his laptop and began searching for information about the history of the Sanders house online. He found several old articles in the local online newspaper and a forum where town residents discussed paranormal phenomena. The Sanders house was mentioned there multiple times. He spent the night in a small hotel, permeated with the cozy atmosphere of a small town. Sleep wouldn't come. His thoughts kept returning to the woman's voice he had heard in the house. Trying to calm himself down, he convinced himself that it was all just a game of his tired imagination. The next morning, returning to the house to sort through documents, Michael heard the voice from the adjacent room again. It was crying, a quiet, prolonged sound that rolled through the corridors like a light wave of mist. He froze, listening. The cry carried such deep pain and despair that his heart involuntarily tightened. The sound gradually faded, dissolving into the darkness, but the feeling of someone's presence lingered for a long time. After lunch, Michael headed to the city archives. In a small, stuffy room where metal shelves were stacked with old newspapers and documents, he spent several hours flipping through the yellowed pages of local publications. Further searches in the archives revealed several more articles about the house. In one of them, a local journalist hinted at the suspicious behavior of the Sanders family after their maid's disappearance. They refused to communicate with the press and hastily hired an expensive lawyer. The article also mentioned that shortly before her disappearance, Sarah had been distressed and told a friend about some terrible things she had witnessed in the house. Michael leaned back in the old archive chair, and it quietly creaked. All these details were forming a chilling picture. If the girl had indeed seen something illegal in the house, her disappearance was unlikely to be accidental. And the strange phenomena Mary had talked about, could they be connected to this ancient tragedy? The mystery of this house could be much darker than just mystical phenomena and ghosts. And somewhere in those documents might lie the answer to the question, what happened to the young maid almost 70 years ago? That evening, as the sun was setting on the horizon, Michael was conducting a thorough inspection of one of the rooms on the second floor. While sorting through old papers and items, he suddenly felt the temperature in the room drop sharply. Looking up, he froze. In the corner of the room stood the translucent figure of a young girl. At first, Michael closed his eyes, hoping it was just fatigue playing tricks on his imagination. But when he opened them again, the ghost hadn't disappeared. Instead, the figure began slowly approaching. Her dress swayed in an invisible wind, and her eyes looked directly at him, full of pleading and despair. The ghost raised her hand, pointing to the opposite wall of the room. Her lips moved, but instead of words, Michael heard only a faint whisper, like the rustling of autumn leaves. However, he understood. She was trying to show him something. The next morning, Michael returned to the house and began examining the contents of an old secretary desk in the office on the first floor. Among the papers, he discovered a bundle of yellowed letters, correspondence between members of the Sanders family from late 1955. Some phrases caused particular alarm. "We need to be more careful. If anyone finds out, the consequences will be catastrophic. I can't sleep. I keep thinking about what happened. Maybe we should have. The wall is secure. No one will ever find. Michael felt chills run down his spine. Now he was almost certain. The Sanders family didn't just know about the young maid's disappearance. They were directly involved in her death. And somewhere in this house, behind one of the old walls, evidence of their crime had to be hidden. Suddenly, the silence in the house was broken. He saw Sarah's ghost again. Her translucent figure appeared before him, emitting a faint blue glow. This time her face expressed impatience and determination. She pointed her hand towards the old wooden doors at the end of the corridor that led to the basement, then vanished as if dissolving into thin air. Michael understood. This wasn't just a random appearance. The ghost was trying to guide him to something important. His heart began beating faster as he approached the basement doors. The old hinges creaked loudly when he pulled them towards himself. Examining the basement, he immediately noticed one of the walls. It was different from the others. The bricks were laid unevenly, and in some places noticeably differed in color. Michael ran his hand over the surface, feeling irregularities and depressions under his fingers. Suddenly, the temperature in the basement dropped sharply. The flashlight flickered and then went out completely. In the darkness, he saw the familiar translucent figure. This time, the ghost was much closer than ever before. Sarah, now he had no doubts it was her, stopped by the wall and slowly raised her hand, pointing to a specific spot. Michael's heart was pounding as he picked up the tools. Each hammer strike echoed through the empty basement with an eerie resonance. Brick by brick, he methodically dismantled the wall, and with each minute, his anxiety grew. Finally, in the dim flashlight beam, he saw what he was looking for. In a small niche in the wall lay human remains. Michael recoiled but forced himself to move closer. Among the bones, he noticed remnants of clothing, the same ones described in the newspaper article about Sarah's disappearance. But the most horrifying discovery was the skull with a clearly visible fracture at the back of the head. This wasn't just a death. It was a brutal murder. Cold fury overtook Michael. The Sanders family hadn't just covered up an innocent girl's death. They were her killers. The ghost appeared one last time. This time, her face expressed both sadness and relief simultaneously. She looked at Michael with gratitude, and he understood. Now that the truth was revealed, her soul would finally find peace. Michael hesitated for a long time before calling the police. He knew his story might seem incredible, but the truth had to come to light. When law enforcement arrived, he detailed all his findings: the letters, the marks on the wall, and of course, the remains in the basement. At first, the detectives were skeptical of him, but when they saw the evidence and the examination confirmed the remains belonged to Sarah, their attitude changed. The missing person case was reopened, now as a murder investigation. However, the investigation faced an unexpected obstacle. All the Sanders family members involved in the crime had already passed away. Justice in the traditional sense became impossible. But for Michael, it was still a victory. The truth had finally come to light, and the soul of an innocent girl found peace. He understood that this investigation had changed him forever. Returning to ordinary legal practice after such an experience was impossible. The senior partner at Sutton & Partners called him to his office the day after the local newspaper published the story about the discovery in the Sanders house. The conversation was brief and unpleasant. The Sanders' grandchildren were among the firm's most important clients, and Michael's investigation had jeopardized years of business relationships. His dismissal was inevitable, yet Michael had no regrets. He understood that the choice between career and justice was inevitable, and he had made the right choice. Now, free from corporate obligations, he could focus on what he considered truly important. A few months later, Michael purchased a small office in the center of the same town. He decided to open his own legal practice there, and his approach to cases changed fundamentally. He became more attentive to details that others might miss, more sensitive to the stories hidden behind dry facts. Walking past the old Sanders house, he felt a slight chill, not from fear, but from the realization that this was where his new story began. The house no longer seemed gloomy. It had become a symbol that truth always finds its way to light. In his new office, Michael hung an old photograph of the house. For visitors, it was just part of the decor, but for him, a reminder that justice can come in different ways, and that sometimes one should listen not only to the voice of reason, but also to the whispers of intuition. And although Sarah's ghost no longer appeared, Michael often remembered her, not as a specter that haunted him in dark corridors, but as a symbol of an unbreakable pursuit of truth. He knew that somewhere in eternity, her soul had finally found the peace it had sought for so long.